At 7:20 a.m. on July 18, 1998, 19-year-old Nathaniel Nate Mercer entered the backcountry of Olympic National Park in Washington state with 25-year-old Warren Pike. 4 days later, Nate failed to return. Within the week, investigators would recover his equipment and blood from the site of a rock slide, but no body. The only person who claimed to know what had happened was Warren, and his account would become the foundation of a disappearance that remained unresolved for 14 years. Nate lived with his family in Tacoma, Washington. He was the oldest of 3 children born to Julian and Elaine Mercer. Julian worked as a civil engineer and had built a stable life for the family through years of routine employment. Elaine was practical and private, known within the household as the parent who dealt with problems directly rather than allowing uncertainty to dominate them. Their second son, Gavin, was 17 in 1998. Their youngest child, Mallory, was 15. By 19, Nate had developed a serious interest in hiking and climbing. He was not an expert mountaineer, but he had enough experience to understand basic backcountry preparation and had completed several demanding trips. Earlier that year, he began spending time with a loosely organized group of local climbers. It was there that he met Warren Pike. Warren was 6 years older and considerably more experienced. Within the group, he was regarded as capable and confident in difficult terrain. His relationship with Nate gradually developed into an informal mentorship. Nate trusted his judgment, and nothing known to the Mercer family at the time gave them an obvious reason to question that trust. The July trip originated with Warren. He proposed a multi-day route into Olympic National Park that would take them well beyond the areas normally visited by casual hikers. Nate accepted. Their plan was straightforward: enter the backcountry on July 18th and return on July 22nd. The family knew where Nate was going, who was accompanying him, and approximately when to expect him home. July 22nd passed without either man returning. When there was still no contact, the Mercer family reported the situation. Search personnel began gathering information about the planned route, equipment, and likely locations where 2 climbers could have encountered difficulty. At that stage, the case was treated as a wilderness emergency. There was no immediate evidence suggesting criminal activity. That assessment changed only partially when Warren Pike emerged from the backcountry alone. According to the account he gave authorities, the 2 men had encountered a rock slide during the trip. Nate had been struck and seriously injured. Warren said Nate lost consciousness and appeared unlikely to survive without immediate assistance. He claimed deteriorating conditions made remaining at the location dangerous, and that he had eventually made the decision to leave Nate behind and seek help. The statement gave search teams a defined area and a plausible explanation. It also placed Warren in the unusual position of being both the principal witness and the only surviving source of information about Nate's final known hours. Search personnel entered the area Warren identified. They found evidence consistent with a rock slide. They also recovered items belonging to Nate. More importantly, investigators discovered blood on rock near the reported accident site. Testing established that the blood belonged to Nate Mercer. For the family and the authorities, the finding appeared to confirm the central part of Warren's account. Nate had been at the location, and he had been injured there. What investigators could not find was Nate himself. Teams searched the surrounding terrain for days. They considered the possibility that an injured Nate had regained consciousness and attempted to move. They examined areas where a body might have fallen or become concealed. The search expanded beyond the immediate location of the blood evidence. Nothing produced a body. Nothing produced a confirmed trail leading away from a site. Nothing established where Nate had gone after his blood was left on that rock. Eventually, the official search was suspended. Nate Mercer remained classified as missing and was considered likely dead. The conclusion was not based on the recovery of human remains. It was based on circumstances: a serious wilderness accident, physical evidence of injury, prolonged exposure, and the absence of any confirmed sighting after July 18th. For the Mercer family, that distinction mattered. There was no body to bury and no final medical determination. There is only Warren's account, the blood evidence, and the judgment that Nate probably could not have survived. A memorial service was held later. Warren attended as the man who had been with Nate when the presumed fatal accident occurred. His presence fit the accepted version of events. He was not publicly treated as a suspect. There was no evidence then establishing that he had deliberately harmed Nate, and the physical evidence at the rock slide appeared to support what he had reported. Mallory Mercer, nevertheless, left the memorial with a persistent doubt. At 15, she had no investigative training and no factual basis for challenging the official understanding of the disappearance. She could not identify a contradiction strong enough to reopen the case or accuse Warren of anything. The evidence available to her family pointed toward a wilderness tragedy. But the absence of Nate remained unresolved in a way the explanation did not satisfy. The case contained a confirmed injury, but no victim. It contained a witness who had survived, but no independent account of what occurred after the rock slide. It contained enough evidence to explain why Nate might have died, yet nothing proving that he had. As months passed, that uncertainty became part of the Mercer family's life. Officially, Nate was a missing 19-year-old presumed dead in Olympic National Park. Warren Pike was the surviving companion who had returned to report the accident. For everyone outside the family, the file looked increasingly like another fatal disappearance in remote terrain. For Mallory, it looked like something unfinished. She could not yet know that the missing body was not merely an unanswered detail. It was the first indication that the accepted version of Nate Mercer's disappearance concealed something far more serious. The Mercer family learned to function without learning what had happened to Nate. The official search had ended, but the absence of a body prevented the case from becoming a complete death in the minds of those closest to him. Elaine remained in the family home in Tacoma and kept much of Nate's property. Julian returned to work and maintained the routines that had supported the household before the disappearance. Gavin eventually left for college and began building a separate adult life. None of those developments resolved the central fact recorded in the case file. Nate had vanished after being injured, and no one had established where he went afterward. Mallory responded differently. The doubt she had carried away from the memorial did not develop into an accusation against Warren Pike. There was no evidence available to justify one. Instead, it changed the direction of her life. After graduating from high school, she attended college in Washington and began taking courses connected to wilderness first aid and emergency response. What initially appeared to be a practical interest became increasingly specific. She wanted to understand how people disappeared in remote terrain and how trained searchers reconstructed what had happened when the obvious explanation failed. She eventually joined volunteer search and rescue operations. The work removed much of the mystery from wilderness disappearances. Lost hikers usually left patterns. Injured climbers made decisions that could be reconstructed from terrain, equipment, and physical evidence. Search teams learned to distinguish probable movement from impossible movement and meaningful traces from irrelevant ones. Mallory became experienced in that process. She participated in searches involving missing hikers, injured climbers, and people who did not survive long enough to be recovered alive. The work also taught her something less reassuring. A search could be methodical and still fail. Physical evidence could establish one part of an event without explaining the rest. A credible witness could determine the direction of an investigation simply because no second account existed. Those facts gave Nate's case a different meaning as Mallory grew older. She still had no proof that the original conclusion was wrong. Nate's blood had been found at the rock slide. Warren had returned and reported an accident. Searchers had found no reliable evidence showing that Nate left the area alive. Mallory understood enough about investigations to know that suspicion could not replace evidence. Warren eventually left Washington. His departure occurred without any development significant enough to change his status in Nate's file. He remained the surviving climbing companion, not a charged suspect. As the years passed, his name became less active in the Mercer household. Julian died without receiving a definitive answer about his oldest son. Elaine remained in Tacoma. Gavin established his own life elsewhere. Mallory continued search and rescue work. By the summer of 2012, she was 29 and had accumulated substantial field experience. She had learned how quickly routine assignments could become emergencies and how often important evidence first appeared insignificant. That training became relevant when park personnel identified signs of unauthorized habitation inside a remote section of Olympic National Park. The initial report did not concern a missing person. Rangers had detected indications that people were occupying protected backcountry beyond the normal areas used by recreational visitors. The location was several miles from ordinary access routes. Evidence suggested the occupation was not temporary. Park authorities needed personnel to enter the area, document what was there, determine whether anyone was present, and assess the unauthorized use. Mallory was assigned to the inspection with Ranger Russell Vance and volunteer Colin Avery. Nothing in the assignment connected it to Nate Mercer. The three entered the backcountry under the assumption that they were dealing with an administrative violation. Unauthorized camps were not automatically criminal operations. People sometimes remained in protected areas longer than regulations permitted, built illegal structures, or attempted to live beyond established campgrounds. The task was to locate the site and establish the scale of the problem. As they moved farther from maintained access, the evidence became harder to interpret as casual camping. The first significant indication was permanence. What they eventually located was not a single tent or the remains of a temporary campsite. There were multiple crude structures designed for continued occupation. Separate areas had been established for sleeping, food storage, and common use. Tools had been retained and organized. A water source had been incorporated into the settlement's daily needs. Food was being cultivated. The site required labor. It required planning. Most importantly, it required time. Russell began treating the location as an established, unauthorized settlement rather than an abandoned camp. Colin documented what could be identified without disturbing the site. Mallory evaluated the same evidence from the perspective of someone accustomed to determining how long people had occupied remote locations. The conclusion was unavoidable. Whoever lived there had not arrived recently. The settlement represented a sustained existence outside ordinary oversight. Its occupants had created enough infrastructure to remain separated from normal services and routine public contact. That fact did not establish a serious crime, but it immediately raised questions that the original assignment had not been designed to answer. How many people lived there was unknown. Their identities were unknown. How long they had remained there was unknown. Whether every person at the settlement was there voluntarily was also unknown. The team had entered expecting to document an illegal campsite. Instead, they had found evidence of a small community functioning deep inside protected land with no obvious connection to the outside systems that normally recorded where people lived. For Mallory, the discovery carried another implication. Years of search work had taught her that people could remain missing because investigators searched the wrong place, accepted the wrong assumption, or stopped asking the right question after the available evidence appeared sufficient. She did not yet connect the settlement to Nate. There was still no reason to. At that point, the structures represented only an unexplained human presence in a remote section of Olympic National Park. Then the team confirmed that the settlement was occupied. Someone was nearby. The administrative inspection had reached the point where the people behind the structures would have to be identified, and the first person they encountered would turn a routine backcountry assignment into something far more serious. The first resident appeared before the team had completed its preliminary documentation of the settlement. He was a man who seemed to be in his early 30s, dressed in worn clothing suited to prolonged life outdoors. Nothing about his condition suggested that he had arrived recently. His appearance, the organized settlement, and the practical systems already identified around the site supported the same conclusion. This was not temporary occupation. Russell Vance took responsibility for the initial contact. The purpose remained administrative. He needed a name, identification, and explanation for the unauthorized structures, and basic information about how many people were using the area. The man identified himself only as Silas. He provided no last name. He had no identification available. That immediately changed the character of the encounter. A person living illegally on protected land without identification did not automatically indicate criminal activity, but it created a problem that could not be resolved through a routine citation. Russell continued gathering information while Colin Avery recorded details about the settlement. Silas acknowledged that he had been living there for a long time. He also confirmed that other people were associated with the site. He did not provide their identities immediately and indicated that he would need to consult them before giving more information. His manner was controlled rather than evasive. He did not behave like someone surprised by law enforcement contact, nor did he appear interested in leaving before the inspection was completed. His responses were careful and limited to what had been asked. Mallory remained outside the primary exchange and watched him. At first, her attention was professional. Search and rescue experience had trained her to notice inconsistencies between what people reported and what their circumstances suggested. Silas appeared accustomed to isolation. His clothing had been repeatedly repaired. His knowledge of the settlement was practical. He seemed to understand its water and food systems as parts of ordinary life rather than emergency arrangements. Then Mallory began noticing something unrelated to the investigation. His face seemed familiar. The recognition was not immediate enough to become certainty. The man in front of her was older than Nate had been when he disappeared. His appearance had been altered by years outdoors, and there was no rational reason for Mallory to expect her brother in an unauthorized settlement inside Olympic National Park. She initially treated the reaction as irrelevant. Russell continued establishing Silas's background. Without formal identification, even basic questions became important. Silas eventually indicated that he had lived in Tacoma before coming to the backcountry. That information narrowed Mallory's attention. Tacoma alone proved nothing. It was a large enough city for coincidence to remain the obvious explanation. She continued observing without interfering. Then Silas referred to the high school he had attended. It was Nate's school. The combination was no longer easy to dismiss. Mallory had spent years learning not to turn intuition into evidence. Recognition under emotional pressure was unreliable. Families of missing people frequently saw resemblance where none existed. Age progression, complicated facial comparison, and memory could preserve a person inaccurately after prolonged absence. She therefore approached the possibility as she would any uncertain field observation. She looked for specific features: the structure around the eyes, the proportions of the forehead, the cheekbones, the relationship between the eyebrows and the upper face. None was conclusive independently. Together, they produced a resemblance strong enough to require verification. Mallory carried an old photograph of Nate on her phone. The photograph showed him at 17, before the climbing trip and before his face became fixed in the family's memory as that of a missing 19-year-old. She opened the image privately and compared it with Silas. The difference in age was substantial. The underlying structure was not. For the first time since entering the settlement, Mallory considered a possibility that contradicted everything the Mercer family had been told after the rock slide. Nate might not have died there. She did not confront Silas. She did not tell Russell that she believed the unidentified man might be her brother. Instead, she used the established coordination system to request an escalation. She asked for the available image of Silas to be compared against missing person records, specifically the 1998 file for Nathaniel Mercer. The request moved through the ranger station without alerting the man being checked. Russell continued questioning Silas about the settlement. Colin continued documenting structures. From Silas's perspective, the encounter remained an inspection concerning unauthorized occupation of federal land. At the station, personnel retrieved Nate Mercer's old case material. The file still contained the essential elements that had defined the disappearance. 19 years old, missing after entering Olympic National Park with Warren Pike, blood confirmed at a rock slide, body never recovered. A photograph from the file was placed beside the current image of Silas. The resemblance was immediately significant. It was not treated as identification. Facial similarity could justify further investigation, but it could not establish that Silas was Nate Mercer. Still, the comparison was strong enough that the station stopped treating Mallory's request as a speculative concern. The information was elevated. 12 minutes after Mallory initiated the request, Russell received instructions. Silas was not to leave. The contact was to remain calm. He was not to be told why the team's interest in him had changed. Federal authorities were being contacted. The instructions transformed the legal and psychological dimensions of the encounter. Minutes earlier, Silas had been an unidentified resident of an illegal settlement. He was now potentially a man officially presumed dead after a disappearance supported by physical evidence. Mallory understood what followed from that possibility. If Silas was Nate, then the accepted account of 1998 was incomplete. Nate's blood of the rock slide would still be real. His injury could still have occurred, but his disappearance could no longer be explained simply by death in inaccessible terrain. Someone would have to explain how an injured 19-year-old had survived, acquired another name, and remained disconnected from his family while living inside a hidden community. One person had controlled the original explanation: Warren Pike. Mallory had not seriously considered his name in years. Now it returned to the center of the case with a different significance. He had been the last known person with Nate. He had identified the accident site. He had provided the account that directed the search. He had returned alone. And because Nate's blood had been found where Warren said it would be, investigators had possessed a physical fact that appeared to validate everything around it. Mallory still had no proof that Warren had lied. She had only an unidentified man calling himself Silas, a shared hometown, the name of a school, a disturbing facial resemblance, and an old missing person photograph that had caused authorities to escalate the encounter. It was enough to prevent Silas from disappearing again. It was also enough to reopen a question the original investigation had never been able to answer. If the man standing inside that settlement was Nathaniel Mercer, then what had actually happened after the blood was left on the rock? Additional park personnel reached the settlement while Russell maintained the administrative contact with Silas. Among them was a senior ranger assigned to coordinate the response. The information from the station had already changed the purpose of the operation. The site still required documentation as an unauthorized occupation, but the unidentified man at its center was now connected to an unresolved missing person file. The facial comparison had not established identity. It had established enough structural similarity to justify immediate federal involvement. The old photograph of Nate and the current image of Silas showed consistent features despite the difference in age. Combined with Tacoma and the high school reference, the possibility could no longer be treated as coincidence. The senior ranger first addressed the more immediate question presented by the settlement. Authorities needed to determine whether anyone was being held there against their will or required medical assistance. Silas denied that either condition existed. When asked to help bring the other residents forward voluntarily, he did not immediately comply. The delay increased concern. There were structures for multiple occupants, but the team had encountered only one person. No one knew where the others were, whether they were avoiding authorities or whether Silas had any control over their decisions. Eventually, Silas signaled for them. People began arriving from different parts of the surrounding area. By the time the group assembled, investigators counted 11 residents in total. Their apparent ages ranged from young adulthood to nearly 60. Their clothing and familiarity with the settlement suggested prolonged residence rather than temporary participation. No one appeared to be demanding rescue. That did not eliminate the possibility of coercion. One older man immediately drew attention because of the way the group organized itself around him. He did not need to identify himself as an authority figure. The behavior of the others supplied that information. He remained slightly separated while still occupying a position that gave him unusual influence over the group. Mallory watched Silas when the older man appeared. The change was subtle but important. Silas had been calm with Russell, and had answered administrative questions without obvious distress. In the presence of the older resident, however, his attention became more closely aligned with the group's internal structure. To Mallory, who had encountered people emerging from prolonged high-control environments during rescue work, the pattern suggested learned submission rather than ordinary respect. It was not evidence of a crime. It was another reason not to assume that statements of voluntary residence represented the entire situation. Federal investigators arrived after the park authorities secured the site and established procedures for separating the residents. The lead investigator was FBI Special Agent Rebecca Sloan. Her first priority was to prevent the group from producing a single collective account before individual histories could be documented. Each resident was interviewed separately. Mallory did not participate. Her possible biological relationship to Silas made direct involvement inappropriate. She remained available because investigators believed visual identification might later become relevant. Silas's interview produced several confirmations. He acknowledged that he had once lived in Tacoma. He confirmed the school he had attended. He also indicated that Silas was not the name he had used during his earlier life. He maintained, however, that abandoning his previous identity had been his own decision. That assertion created a direct conflict with the missing person record. Nathaniel Mercer had not disappeared after informing his family that he intended to leave. He had vanished during a climbing trip after an accident. A search had followed. Blood had been recovered. His family had spent years without confirmed evidence that he had survived. If Silas was Nate, investigators were dealing with two incompatible histories. One described a young man who had voluntarily left his former life. The other documented a family that believed he had died in the wilderness. Rebecca requested a DNA sample. Silas agreed. Mallory provided the comparison sample necessary for a preliminary sibling analysis. The testing available to investigators could not replace a complete laboratory examination, but it could establish whether a close biological relationship was sufficiently probable to guide the investigation. The waiting period forced the case into an unusual position. Authorities had located a living man who resembled Nate, shared his hometown, attended his school, and acknowledged having another identity. Yet until the biological comparison returned, every conclusion remained provisional. Mallory continued helping with documentation away from the interviews. She did not approach Silas as a sister. She could not allow recognition to become certainty before the evidence supported it. The result eventually removed that uncertainty. The preliminary analysis calculated a probability greater than 99.7% that Mallory and Silas were first-degree biological siblings. Silas was Nathaniel Mercer. The finding immediately changed the meaning of the original case. Nate had survived the rock slide. He had not vanished into inaccessible terrain. He had lived long enough to become an adult under another name, while his family believed he was dead. Rebecca informed him of the biological finding and the unresolved missing person record. Nate did not respond as investigators expected from someone who had deliberately disappeared. He rejected the central implication. According to the account he had believed for years, his family already knew he had survived. He understood that they had been given an opportunity to remain in contact and had chosen not to do so. The people in the settlement had therefore become his family after his original one had abandoned him. That belief was incompatible with every documented action taken by the Mercers after his disappearance. Rebecca focused on its source. The question was no longer whether Nate had chosen to remain in the wilderness. Investigators needed to determine what information had shaped that choice. Nate identified the person responsible for telling him that his family had known where he was. Within the community, that person had occupied a central position and carried a special designation reflecting his authority. Investigators pressed for the name he had used before assuming that role. Nate provided it. Warren Pike. The surviving climber from 1998 had not merely been connected to the beginning of Nate's disappearance. He had remained connected to Nate after the search ended. The implication was immediate and severe. Warren had returned from Olympic National Park, claiming he had left an unconscious young man behind to seek help. He had allowed authorities to search for a body while the Mercer family prepared for a death that had never been confirmed. Now Nate was alive, and the explanation he had carried into adulthood had come from the same man who controlled the original account. The missing person investigation was no longer about where Nathaniel Mercer had gone. It was about why he had believed, for 14 years, that no one wanted him to come back. The confirmation of Nate's identity forced investigators to separate two questions that had been treated as one. The first concerned what had happened to the rock slide. The second concerned everything that had happened afterward. Nate could answer parts of both, but his account had been shaped by information supplied almost entirely by Warren Pike. Rebecca Sloan therefore approached his memories as evidence that required reconstruction, not as a complete record of events. Mallory provided the first material capable of challenging the version Nate had believed. Her phone contained photographs collected across the years following his disappearance. They were ordinary family records rather than evidence prepared for an investigation. That made them more significant. They documented a family continuing to live around an unresolved absence. Nate saw Gavin's graduation and later stages of his adult life. He saw photographs showing Elaine at family gatherings and at the Tacoma home. He saw Julian in the years before his death. The images established a continuous history that contained no sign of the deliberate rejection Nate had been taught to accept. For him, the contradiction was immediate. The family in those photographs had not behaved like people who knew where he was and had chosen to sever contact. Their lives reflected loss. Julian had died without knowing that his oldest son was alive. Elaine had remained in the same home. Mallory had built part of her adult life around searching for missing people. The central belief supporting Nate's separation from them began to collapse. Investigators then turned to the origin of the settlement and Warren's role in it. Interviews with the residents produced a consistent basic structure. Warren had gradually gathered people who were vulnerable to separation from conventional life. Some had experienced family conflict. Others had gone through personal crises or had become deeply dissatisfied with ordinary social structures. The community presented itself as a place organized around self-reliance and withdrawal from institutions its members considered corrupting or unnecessary. In practice, Warren occupied the center. He controlled the group's relationship with the outside world. He influenced how members understood their previous lives and how much contact they maintained beyond the settlement. The longer residents remained inside that structure, the more difficult independent verification became. Nate's case was different from the others. He had not entered the community after consciously rejecting his previous life. His path began with the accident. During repeated interviews, investigators reconstructed his memory of July 18, 1998. Nate confirmed that the rock slide had occurred. He had been struck and injured. His blood at the site was therefore genuine, explaining why the original search had found physical evidence consistent with Warren's account. Nate also remembered losing consciousness. When he regained awareness, he was no longer at the location where the rock slide had occurred. He was in an improvised camp at a significant distance from the original site, with Warren acting as his caretaker and sole source of information. That detail changed the investigation. Warren had told authorities that he left Nate near the rock slide because Nate appeared unlikely to survive and because seeking help was the only remaining option. Nate's memory established something fundamentally different. Warren had not simply abandoned an injured companion and returned for rescuers. He had moved him. Investigators concluded that the relocation occurred while Nate was unable to understand or resist what was happening. Warren had transferred him farther from established routes and into an area where accidental discovery would be considerably less likely. At the same time, the original accident site had been left with evidence that supported a different story. Nate's belongings remained associated with the area. His blood remained on the rock. The rock slide itself was real. Those facts had given Warren's statement credibility because investigators were able to verify the physical foundation of his account. The deception did not require fabricating an accident. It required controlling what the accident appeared to mean. Once Nate was removed, the search teams were looking for an injured or dead man in the place where Warren said he had left him. Nate was no longer there. After Nate regained consciousness, Warren began constructing a second version of events, this time for Nate himself. He represented the route back as unusable. He presented Nate's injuries as an obstacle to normal evacuation. He claimed that efforts had been made to obtain assistance and that authorities were aware of the situation. Most importantly, Warren told Nate that his family had been informed. At that stage, Nate was injured, isolated, and dependent on the only person who appeared to understand their circumstances. He had no independent source of information. He could not verify whether rescuers were searching, whether his family had been contacted, or whether returning through another route was possible. Warren controlled every answer. The manipulation did not initially require Nate to believe that his family had abandoned him. It required only enough uncertainty to delay direct contact. Each delay created additional dependence. Each unverified explanation made the next one easier to accept. The photographs on Mallory's phone exposed the eventual result. Nate had spent his adult life believing that the silence from Tacoma represented a decision made by his family. The Mercer family had spent the same period believing that silence represented death. Between those two realities stood Warren Pike. Rebecca's investigation now had a working theory supported by Nate's memories and the physical evidence from 1998. The rockslide had provided Warren with an authentic accident. Nate's injury had provided vulnerability. The remote terrain had provided isolation. The blood and abandoned equipment had provided credibility for the disappearance. What remained was to determine whether Warren's actions had been improvised after the accident or whether the location to which Nate was moved had been selected in advance. The developing evidence pointed toward preparation. That distinction was critical. If Warren had acted spontaneously, the case involved exploitation of an unexpected emergency. If he had prepared the isolated location before the climb, then the accident had not created the plan. It had merely given him the opportunity to execute it. The investigation into Warren Pike's influence over Nate did not begin with the settlement itself. It began with the first months after the rockslide, when Nate was still injured, dependent on Warren, and unable to verify anything he was being told. By the time federal investigators reconstructed that period, they understood that the physical isolation had only been one part of the control. The more effective barrier had been informational. After Nate recovered enough to think beyond his immediate condition, he wanted contact with his family. Warren did not refuse outright. Instead, he delayed. He told Nate that communication had to be handled carefully and that arrangements were being made. Each explanation preserved the possibility that contact would eventually happen. That distinction mattered. A direct refusal might have created suspicion. Repeated postponement allowed Nate to remain hopeful while gradually accepting Warren as the person responsible for managing his connection to the outside world. The pattern continued for months. During that period, Nate became increasingly integrated into the small community forming around Warren. Other people arrived. Relationships developed. Daily survival required cooperation, and the settlement became more organized. The practical demands of food, water, shelter, and shared responsibilities gave the group an internal structure that occupied attention and reduced the importance of outside contact. Warren remained at the center of that structure. He controlled information coming into the group and influenced how members interpreted the lives they had left behind. For some residents, separation had begun voluntarily. They had arrived during periods of family conflict, personal crisis, or dissatisfaction with conventional life. Their reasons differed, but their dependence on the community gradually created the same result. Nate's situation remained fundamentally different. He had entered that environment through injury and deception. Warren had told him that his family knew he was alive. Later, the absence of direct contact was presented as evidence that they had chosen not to maintain a relationship. Because Nate had no independent access to them, there was nothing available to contradict the claim. Eventually, he stopped asking. Investigators identified that moment as one of the most important stages in the manipulation. Warren no longer needed to prevent Nate from contacting his family if Nate no longer believed contact was wanted. Control had moved from an external restriction into Nate's own understanding of his circumstances. The isolation then reinforced itself. There were no ordinary social connections through which Nate could encounter someone who knew the Mercer family. There was no regular communication system that allowed him to test Warren's statements. The community's internal logic treated separation from conventional society as evidence of independence rather than deprivation. Over time, the absence of information became its own proof. If his family wanted him, Nate believed they would have found a way to reach him. If no message arrived, he assumed Warren had been telling the truth. The deception no longer required constant maintenance. The community maintained it. Federal investigators moved quickly once that structure became clear. Warren had left Washington years earlier, but authorities traced him to a residence outside the state. He was arrested after investigators connected his role in the original disappearance with the information emerging from the settlement. The arrest did not resolve the central evidentiary problem. Nate could describe what he remembered, but his memories had been formed during injury, isolation, and prolonged psychological manipulation. Defense attorneys could challenge portions of his account as incomplete or influenced by later discoveries. Investigators needed evidence independent of Nate. They found it among Warren's possessions. Warren had maintained written records across the period in which Nate disappeared and the community developed. The documents were not vague reflections on communal life. They contained descriptions of the events surrounding the original accident, the handling of evidence, and the gradual management of Nate's understanding of what had happened. The records transformed the case. They supported the conclusion that Nate had been moved from the rockslide while unconscious. They documented Warren's efforts to preserve the appearance that Nate had remained near the accident site. They also described the continuing process of controlling what Nate believed about his family and the outside world. One entry became particularly important. It had been written approximately a year after the disappearance. Warren described Nate as having reached what he considered a state of complete acceptance. The meaning was unmistakable in the context of the surrounding records. Nate had stopped expecting contact from his family. He had stopped treating the settlement as a temporary condition. Warren believed the work of the first year was complete. Nate would not leave. For investigators, the language exposed the psychological structure of the crime more clearly than any later explanation could have done. Warren had not recorded the recovery of a young man who independently decided to abandon his former life. He had recorded a process. He had monitored Nate's resistance. He had measured the decline of that resistance. He had recognized the point at which the deception no longer required active reinforcement. The documents also answered the question that had emerged during the reconstruction of the rock slide. The location to which Nate had been moved had not been selected randomly after the accident. Warren had known where he was taking him. The isolation was not simply the consequence of difficult terrain. It had been useful. The criminal case expanded around that evidence. Warren faced charges connected to unlawful restraint, fraud, false reporting, and interference with evidence from the original disappearance. The prosecution no longer depended primarily on proving what Nate remembered from an altered and vulnerable state. Warren had documented his own methods. The records showed how little physical force was necessary once information became controlled. Nate had not spent his adult life behind a locked door. The barriers around him were constructed from false explanations, delayed contact, dependency, and the belief that the people he loved had already rejected him. That belief had been strong enough to keep him where Warren wanted him. The prosecution eventually secured convictions on the principal charges, and Warren received a lengthy federal prison sentence. His own records became among the most damaging evidence presented against him. For Mallory, the documents resolved the suspicion that had begun at the memorial service, but replaced it with something colder. The family had not failed to find Nate because they stopped searching too soon. Nate had not failed to return because he chose another life. Warren had created two separate realities and kept them from touching. One family believed his son was dead. One son believed his family had abandoned him. The distance between those realities had never been measured in miles. Warren Pike's conviction answered the legal question of responsibility, but it did not restore Nate Mercer to the life that had existed before the climbing trip. The criminal case could identify deception, establish intent, and impose punishment. It could not reverse the psychological consequences of living inside a false history for most of his adult life. Nate did not return to the Tacoma house immediately after his identity was confirmed. Federal investigators and victim support personnel arranged temporary housing away from the settlement. A forensic psychologist began working with him while investigators continued collecting his account. The separation was deliberate. Removing Nate from Warren's influence did not mean that the beliefs created under that influence disappeared at the same time. For years, Nate had understood his past through a simple explanation. His family knew he was alive. They had been given the opportunity to remain connected. They had chosen not to. That belief had influenced every decision that followed. Now the evidence showed that its foundation was false. The photographs Mallory had shown him were only the beginning. Investigators had records of the original search. There were reports documenting Elaine's calls, the search operation, the recovery of Nate's equipment, the blood testing, and the decision to suspend active efforts only after teams failed to locate him. There had never been a confirmed death. There had never been communication informing the Mercers that Nate had survived. The family had not rejected him. They had been deceived from the opposite direction. Nate began communicating with Mallory through short messages. He asked practical questions about the family rather than attempting to reconstruct everything at once. Mallory answered what he asked and did not force additional information on him. She understood that pressure would reproduce the same structure investigators were trying to dismantle. For years, Warren had controlled the pace and content of Nate's understanding. Recovery required the opposite. Nate needed access to information without another person deciding what he was ready to believe. Some facts were irreversible. Julian Mercer had died before learning the truth. That information carried a particular weight because Nate's false understanding of his father had been preserved until there was no possibility of correcting it directly. Warren's deception had not merely delayed a reunion. It had removed the possibility of one relationship ever being restored. Gavin had also changed. The 17-year-old brother Nate, remembered, had become an adult with a separate life. Mallory was no longer the 15-year-old girl from the memorial service. Elaine had spent years adapting to the presumed death of a son whose remains had never been recovered. Nate was returning to people he knew and did not know at the same time. The same was true for them. The family remembered a 19-year-old. The man identified through DNA had lived through experiences they had not shared and had developed inside a social structure they barely understood. Treating him as though he could simply resume the life interrupted in 1998 would have ignored the scale of what had happened. Mallory became the most consistent connection. Her search and rescue background helped her maintain distance from the emotional urgency surrounding the discovery. She had spent years learning that people in unstable situations could not always be moved at the speed others preferred. In Nate's case, that principle became personal. Elaine was informed through Gavin rather than through an unexpected official visit. The information had to be delivered carefully because the family had already passed through the process of accepting Nate's probable death. The first facts were limited. Nate had been found. He was alive. His identity had been confirmed. He was not currently in immediate physical danger. The explanation for his disappearance was under investigation. Elaine's first concerns were not about Warren or prosecution. She wanted to know whether Nate was injured and whether he understood that the family had searched for him. The second question went directly to the damage Warren had created. Nate had believed that his family's silence was voluntary. Elaine had believed Nate's silence came from death. Neither side had possessed the information necessary to challenge those conclusions. When Nate eventually made direct contact with his mother, the communication lasted for more than 2 hours. The content remained private, but its importance was clear to those working with the family. It was the first unfiltered exchange between them since before the disappearance. There was no war in between them, no controlled message, no dilada explanation, no intermediary deciding what either person was permitted to know. Afterward, Elaine described Nate in a way that stayed with Mallory. Despite the altered name, the isolation, and the beliefs constructed around him, she recognized her son in the person she heard. That recognition did not erase the damage. Nate still required psychological support. Investigators still needed his cooperation as the criminal case developed. The evidence recovered from Warren's records continued to expose how deliberately his understanding had been manipulated. Nate also had to confront a difficult fact about his own decisions. He had remained at the settlement after his injuries healed. He had formed relationships there. He had participated in the community and eventually stopped attempting to contact Tacoma. Those choices were real, but they had been made inside a reality Warren had manufactured. That distinction became central to understanding the case. Psychological control did not eliminate every act of personal choice. It altered the information from which those choices were made. Nate had not been physically restrained every day. He had been given reasons to believe leaving would return him to people who no longer wanted him. The criminal proceedings could classify Warren's conduct. The family had to live with its consequences. Nate's return, therefore, occurred gradually rather than through a single reunion. Each verified fact removed another part of the false history, but every correction also revealed something that could not be recovered. His mother was alive. His brother and sister were waiting. His father was not. The truth had reopened the way home. It had arrived too late to restore everything that had been waiting there. Nate Mercer returned to the family home in Tacoma several months after his identity was confirmed. The return did not resemble the restoration of a life interrupted in 1998. Too much had changed, and one absence could never be corrected. Julian Mercer had died believing that his oldest son had probably been lost in Olympic National Park. No verdict, psychological treatment, or reunion could alter that fact. Elaine, Gavin, Mallory, and Nate were together again under circumstances none of them had been prepared to experience. The family had spent years adapting to a death without a body. Nate had spent those same years adapting to the belief that the people who raised him had knowingly abandoned him. Both realities had been false, but both had produced permanent consequences. The reunion, therefore, did not close the case in any meaningful psychological sense. It only ended the physical separation. For Nate, returning meant confronting evidence of a life that had continued without him. Family records preserved events he had never witnessed. Gavin had completed his education and established an adult life. Mallory had turned the unresolved disappearance into a professional commitment to finding others. Elaine had remained in Tacoma while learning to live with uncertainty. Nate had his own history from those missing years. He had relationships within the settlement. He had responsibilities there. He had accepted Silas as an identity and had interpreted isolation as a form of independence. Discovering that Warren had manipulated the foundation of those choices did not erase the experiences themselves. That contradiction became one of the most difficult consequences of the case. Nate had been deceived, but he had also lived. The years could not simply be classified as empty time and discarded. Federal prosecutors built their case against Warren Pike around conduct that extended far beyond the false account he had given after the rock slide. The evidence established a pattern involving unlawful restraint, fraud, false reporting, and interference with evidence connected to Nate's disappearance. Nate participated in the legal process, but prosecutors did not have to rely entirely on his reconstructed memories. Warren's own records supplied the most damaging proof. They showed that he had treated Nate's isolation as a process to be managed. He had documented changes in Nate's resistance, his declining expectation of family contact, and the point at which he believed Nate would remain voluntarily. Those writings reduced the space available for Warren to characterize the situation as a mutual decision between adults. The distinction was central. A person could choose isolation. A person could reject family contact. A person could abandon an old identity. But meaningful choice required access to reality. Nate had been denied that access. Warren had controlled the information on which Nate based his decisions, then treated the resulting decisions as proof that the manipulation had succeeded. The prosecution secured convictions on the principal charges, and Warren received a lengthy federal prison sentence. The judgment established criminal responsibility. It did not establish a method for repairing the lives affected by the community he had created. Nate was not the only person who had lived there. 10 other residents had been identified when authorities entered the settlement. Their circumstances differed from his, and not every person had arrived through the same kind of deception. Some had entered during periods of personal crisis or estrangement from ordinary social life. All had spent significant time inside a structure in which Warren exercised unusual control over information and contact with the outside world. Their cases exposed a broader social problem. High-control environments do not always resemble captivity from the outside. The people inside them may work, cooperate, form relationships, and describe their lives as voluntary. Control can exist without visible restraints when one person acquires enough authority to define what others are permitted to know. Nate's disappearance became an extreme example of that mechanism. The original investigation had not failed because authorities ignored obvious evidence. The rockslide was real. Nate's blood was real. His injuries were real. Warren built the deception around facts that investigators could independently verify. That was what made it effective. A complete fabrication would have been vulnerable to contradiction. Warren instead placed false conclusions around genuine evidence. Searchers found exactly what they had been told they might find, except for the one thing that mattered most: Nate. The absence of a body had remained the unresolved element from the beginning. Mallory had recognized that uncertainty when she was 15, although she lacked the knowledge to explain it. Years later, during a routine assignment in Olympic National Park, she encountered an unidentified man using another name. A reference to a Tacoma high school was enough to make her stop treating resemblance as coincidence. That decision reopened everything. The case ultimately demonstrated how easily trust can become a weapon when it is combined with isolation. Warren had first entered Nate's life as a more experienced climber. That position gave him credibility. The accident created dependence. Isolation removed competing sources of information. Time converted repeated deception into accepted history. Behind the method was a more disturbing form of arrogance. Warren had assumed the right to decide what another person should know, whom that person should trust, and which relationships deserved to survive. He crossed the ethical boundary between influence and ownership, then constructed a social system in which that violation could appear normal. The legal system eventually punished him. It could not return Julian to his son. It could not give Elaine back the years spent mourning someone who was alive. It could not return Nate to 19 or remove the memories formed under a false understanding of his family. The Mercer case ended with a living missing person coming home, but survival was not the same as restoration. Its warning remained colder than the verdict. The most durable prisons are not always built with walls. Sometimes they are built by controlling information until a victim begins defending the boundaries created around him. And when one person becomes convinced that he has the moral right to determine another person's reality, the first casualty is truth. Everything taken after that becomes harder to recover. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Cases like this leave behind more than facts, evidence, and legal consequences. They force us to think about trust, influence, responsibility, and the moment when one person begins to cross a line that should never be crossed. Sometimes the most disturbing crimes are not the ones that are immediately visible. They can grow slowly, hidden behind dependence, isolation, loyalty, or the belief that someone else knows what is best. What do you think is the point where influence becomes control? How much responsibility belongs to the person who manipulates? And how much can society do to recognize the warning signs before the damage becomes permanent? We would like to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment, share your perspective, or discuss the questions this case raised for you. And as always, stay cautious about who you trust with your choices, your relationships, and your version of the truth.